The truth cannot be manipulated. The sharp click of heels echoed across the cold marble floor. Elena Monroe stepped forward into the center of the courtroom, her expression composed as pale light filtered through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Around her, eyes watched, some expectant, some amused, others filled with quiet disdain. She ignored them all. The moment everything changed. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his sharp gaze challenging. At the prosecution's table, Reed arched an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. They thought they controlled this courtroom. They thought they controlled this case. But in 1 second, that illusion would shatter. Elena reached into her coat pocket, fingers closing around smooth leather. With a swift motion, she pulled out a black wallet and flicked it open. The metallic gleam of a United States Secret Service badge caught the light, flashing like a blade under the sharp glow of the overhead fixtures. The room went still. Reed froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The file in his hand slipped from his grip, papers scattering across the table. Across the bench, Judge Whitman's face darkened. The smug confidence vanished from his expression, replaced by something heavier, something dangerously close to fear. Elena's gaze locked onto his, unwavering, unshakable. Her voice cut through the silence, steady and precise, each word honed to a razor's edge. We will follow the law. And this time, no one will manipulate the truth. Be part of the story. Before we dive deeper into this case, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss another gripping story. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another powerful, thought-provoking tale, curated just for you. A hushed narration followed. This is where it all began, but no one could have foreseen where it would lead. You think you know the law better than I do? The judge's voice dripped with mockery, each word laced with the smug arrogance of a man who had wielded unchecked authority for too long. He leaned back in his chair, his cold, scrutinizing gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Silence fell like a heavy shroud. Every eye in the courtroom was now fixed on the black woman standing before the bench. She did not flinch. She did not waver. Instead, Elena Monroe met his gaze, calm, resolute, harboring a secret that had the power to unravel everything. What was about to unfold would send shockwaves through the courtroom, forcing Judge Whitman to reconsider everything he had ever believed to be absolute. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, casting long, golden streaks across the marble floor. The air inside the courtroom vibrated with an almost tangible tension, the kind that only exists when fate is decided in a matter of moments. The defendant's table was a place of forced composure. Elena Monroe sat upright, her hands resting neatly on the polished wood. Her dark brown eyes swept across the room, registering every detail, the smug smirk tugging at Prosecutor Reed's lips, the hushed whispers rippling through the spectators' benches, the measured but unmistakably judgmental glances from the jury. Beside her, Malcolm Monroe gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white, as though it were the only thing anchoring him in place. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, he was usually a pillar of confidence. But weeks of relentless accusations had chipped away at him, piece by piece. The charge of resisting an officer loomed over him like a storm cloud, despite the existence of video evidence proving otherwise. Elena gently placed her hand over his. "Stay calm, Malcolm," she murmured, her voice steady, soothing, like cool water over scorched earth. "The truth always finds its way to the surface. Just hold on a little longer." A heavy wooden door creaked open, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Whitman entered, his black robe billowing slightly with each measured step toward the bench. A man nearing 70, with a sharp nose, thinning white hair, and an air of self-importance that preceded his name. He had a reputation, unyielding, occasionally biased. Not just a rumor, but something he wore like a badge of honor among his peers. Court is now in session. The bailiff's deep voice echoed off the marble walls. Judge Whitman leaned back in his high-backed chair, his gaze sweeping the courtroom with thinly veiled disdain. When his eyes landed on Elena, a smirk played at the corner of his lips, subtle but unmistakable. Like he had already made up his mind. "Let's get this over with," he muttered. His voice wasn't loud, but just enough for the first few rows to catch. Elena remained unfazed. She had seen men like him before, men who noticed the color of her skin before they noticed her competence, who judged her appearance before they listened to a word she said. But she had learned long ago to let their arrogance wash over her like water over stone. Prosecutor Reed shot up from his seat, theatric as ever, adjusting his tie like he was stepping into the spotlight. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thick with rehearsed confidence, "the evidence against the defendant is irrefutable. This is a textbook case of blatant disregard for the law, and no justification can erase that." Elena's jaw tensed, but she said nothing. Not yet. Elena Monroe remained still, her expression composed, but her mind was calculating every angle, every move. She knew how this game was played. Across the room, Prosecutor Reed exuded confidence, his movements deliberate, calculated to project authority. He paced slightly, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he continued, voice smooth, practiced. "What we have here is a man who made a choice. Choice to resist, to obstruct, and to defy the very laws meant to protect us." He turned slightly, eyes flickering toward Malcolm, then back to the jury. "The footage the defense clings to is, at best, inconclusive. A snippet of chaos, nothing more. What truly matters is the testimony of the officers on the scene, sworn, trained professionals who put their lives on the line every day. Their word carries weight." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "And their word is clear, the defendant acted with hostility and refused to comply." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm Monroe exhaled sharply beside her. His fingers twitched against the wood, a silent display of frustration held just beneath the surface. Elena gave his hand the lightest squeeze. A reminder. Control the narrative. Do not let them see your anger. She slowly rose from her chair, moving with deliberate, measured precision. The moment she stood, the energy in the room shifted. All eyes followed her. She straightened her blazer, stepped toward the jury box, and let the silence stretch just long enough to command attention. Then, she spoke. "What we have here is not just a case about choices, but about perception." Her voice was firm, unwavering. Perception that dictates who is seen as a threat. Perception that decides whose truth is taken as fact and whose is dismissed before it's even spoken. She paced slightly, mirroring Reed's earlier movements, but with an air of control that felt effortless rather than rehearsed. "The prosecution wants you to believe that a badge makes a man's word absolute. That it outweighs video evidence, that it outweighs reason. But I ask you, does it outweigh justice?" She stopped, turning to the jury, making sure to meet the eyes of each member. Because justice demands more than taking someone's word for it. Justice demands that we look at all the facts, without bias, without assumption. And the facts, ladies and gentlemen, are simple. Malcolm Monroe did not resist arrest. He did not act with hostility. He did not violate the law. She turned slightly, letting her words settle. But if we are to speak of choices, then let us discuss the choices that led us here today. The choice to ignore exculpatory evidence. The choice to favor testimony over proof. The choice to paint a black man as a criminal before the trial even began. A heavy silence followed. Judge Whitman shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. The air in the courtroom crackled with tension. Then, finally, he spoke. "You tread dangerously close to making this personal, Counselor Monroe." Elena turned to him, her gaze steady, unwavering. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it already is." Elena Monroe had promised Malcolm she would let the attorney do his job. She had sworn she wouldn't interfere, no matter how badly every fiber in her being screamed for her to stand up and set the record straight. Yet, as Reed continued, every carefully chosen word painting Malcolm as a violent menace to society, she could feel her patience fraying like a rope pulled too taut. But in just a moment, the tide would turn. Because Elena Monroe was not just any woman. And Judge Whitman was about to face a truth that would leave the entire courtroom in stunned silence. A man deemed a threat. Elena's stomach twisted with each exaggerated claim, each carefully curated half-truth Reed so easily spun into damning narrative. When he finally finished, he sank into his chair with a self-satisfied smirk, as if the trial was already won. Judge Whitman turned his gaze toward Malcolm's defense attorney, a young man who looked barely out of law school, his shoulders drawn tight under the weight of scrutiny. "Well?" The judge's voice was clipped, impatient. "Do you have anything to say, or are we just going to sit here wasting time?" The attorney stammered out a few words, but his voice was too soft, too unsure. A cold wave of frustration washed over Elena. This trial would not end in justice unless someone took control. And Judge Whitman's disdain for her was growing more blatant with every passing second. He dismissed objections with a lazy wave of his hand. Cut off arguments before they could be fully formed. And when Elena finally took the stand to defend Malcolm, he didn't even try to mask his irritation. A slow, exaggerated sigh escaped him as she stood. "Miss Monroe," he drawled, his voice thick with condescension. "I sincerely hope you're not planning to waste my time with emotional nonsense. We are here for facts, not feelings." The room tensed. A hushed murmur rippled through the gallery, but Judge Whitman's cold glare silenced it in an instant. Elena met his gaze without flinching. Her voice, steady and unyielding, cut through the heavy silence. "I am here only to speak the truth, Your Honor." His lip curled slightly, as if unimpressed. "Very well," he said with mock courtesy. "Let's hear it, then." Elena stepped forward, the rhythmic click of her heels against the polished marble floor the only sound in the courtroom. She could feel the weight of every gaze locked onto her, the unspoken judgment pressing down like a vice. But she would not waver. Years of training had taught her how to command a room, how to remain composed when the pressure was suffocating. Today, she would not let an arrogant judge shake her resolve. Her voice was clear, deliberate, every word carving an undeniable picture of what had truly happened the night Malcolm was arrested. She spoke of a man unjustly targeted, accused without clear evidence. A man whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But each time she tried to expand on a detail, each time she attempted to add crucial context, Judge Whitman interrupted. "Ms. Monroe," Judge Whitman let out a dry, condescending chuckle. "It seems you believe yourself to be an expert in law enforcement. Tell me, do you have any real-world experience in this field, or are you just another armchair activist preaching about justice?" A flicker of heat flared in Elena's chest, but she swallowed it down. "Not now." She returned to her seat, her posture composed, but Whitman's mocking laughter still echoed in her ears. Across the table, Malcolm's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles bone-white against his dark skin. "This isn't over," she murmured under her breath, her voice steady, resolute. "Trust me, Malcolm. It's far from over." The courtroom pulsed with an unspoken tension, as if it were a living, breathing entity feeding off every unuttered word, every barely restrained emotion. The rhythmic ticking of the large clock mounted behind the judge's bench grew impossibly loud, marking the countdown to the inevitable. Elena Monroe sat still, outwardly composed, though a storm raged within her. She had faced high-pressure situations before. But none had ever felt this personal. Across the room, Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His expression was one of pure disdain, his fingers drumming idly against the edge of the bench, an almost lazy gesture, but one that carried an unmistakable warning. What he failed to realize was that he had just made a grave mistake. Because the woman he had dismissed so easily was not someone to be underestimated. And in mere minutes, the truth would rip through the arrogance clinging to him like armor. A reminder of power. He hadn't just dismissed Elena's words, he had challenged her very presence in this courtroom. "All right, Ms. Monroe," Judge Whitman drawled, each syllable coded in derision. "You've had your say. Now, let's return to the matter at hand, your brother's blatant disregard for the law." Beneath the table, Elena's hands curled into tight fists, her nails pressing against her palm. She inhaled deeply, controlling her breath, a skill honed through years of handling high-stakes operations, of diffusing volatile situations with nothing but sheer will and calculated precision. Control the narrative. Do not let them control you. That mantra had carried her through some of the most dangerous missions of her Secret Service career. And yet, here, in this courtroom, under Whitman's disdainful glare, it felt like walking a tightrope stretched over a pit of vipers. Across the room, Prosecutor Reed rose again, his movements practiced, deliberate. He smoothed the lapels of his suit as if preparing for another grand performance. Then, in a voice as slick as polished steel, he began to speak. "Your Honor, I believe we've indulged in enough theatrics for today." Prosecutor Reed's voice carried across the room, losing the same smug confidence that had underscored every argument he had made so far. He turned slightly, glancing at the jury as if reeling them in, feeding into their supposed common sense. "The evidence is clear, the defendant resisted arrest. A video is not the full story. What truly matters here is the testimony of law enforcement officers." A muscle in Elena's jaw twitched, a ghost of a smirk flickering at the edge of her lips before she forced it away. She had watched that video at least a dozen times. Not only was it clear, it was indisputable. The officer had shoved Malcolm without provocation. Then, in a matter of seconds, had drawn his weapon in what should have been nothing more than a routine traffic stop. But this wasn't just about the video. This was about power. About bias. About the narratives that men like Judge Whitman and Reed wove to protect the system they benefited from. She leaned slightly toward her brother, her voice low, just for him. "They're building a story that won't hold. Stay steady, Malcolm. This isn't over." He gave a small nod, but his shoulders remained tense, his body wound tight with silent apprehension. Malcolm had always been the strong one, the protector. Now, shackled by a system designed to break him, he sat there, reduced to a defendant rather than the man she had always known him to be. And that thought sent a slow, simmering heat through Elena's veins. A quiet fury she had long taught herself to suppress. A challenge, thinly veiled. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling, once again, on Elena. "Ms. Monroe," he drawled, his tone carrying an edge of amusement. "Before we proceed, I have a question for you. What exactly qualifies you to speak so passionately about law enforcement procedures?" He leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together. "You seem very confident, but as far as I can tell, you have no practical experience whatsoever." The room tensed. A thick, almost suffocating silence settled over the space. A few murmurs from the gallery. A couple of heads shaking in disbelief at the judge's audacity. Elena tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to hint at the frustration slowly unraveling inside her. She met his gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied, her voice level, deliberate. "I believe my testimony stands on its own merit. I was a direct witness to the incident, and I have reviewed all available evidence thoroughly." Judge Whitman let out a dry, humorless chuckle. It echoed against the high ceilings. "Thoroughly?" He repeated the word like it was a joke only he understood. And yet, you fail to acknowledge the limitations of your own perspective? He gestured loosely toward the jury, as if inviting them in on the joke. But by all means, please, enlighten us. I'm sure your so-called thorough analysis will single-handedly overturn years of legal precedent. The condescension in his voice was razor-sharp. But Elena Monroe didn't flinch. Because what Judge Whitman failed to realize was that he had just handed her exactly what she needed. Elena Monroe remained motionless, her expression unreadable, though inside, she could feel the steady pulse of controlled fury beneath her skin. Judge Whitman had thrown down the gauntlet, thinking he had her cornered. He didn't realize she had been waiting for this moment. She inhaled slowly, exhaled with purpose, and then, deliberately, methodically, she stepped forward. The room, already tense, seemed to shrink as every eye locked onto her. She held Whitman's gaze, unwavering. "You want my credentials, Your Honor." Her voice was calm, but there was something else beneath it, a quiet, dangerous edge. She reached into her jacket, slow and deliberate, the way she had done 1,000 times before. The courtroom held its collective breath. With a measured flick of her wrist, she pulled out a sleek, black leather case and flipped it open. A sharp intake of air rippled through the room. The gleaming badge of the United States Secret Service caught the light, its gold surface almost blinding in the sterile fluorescence of the courtroom. A heavy silence followed. Judge Whitman's expression flickered, just for a second, but Elena caught it. Shock. Recognition. And then, something colder. Fear. Across the room, Prosecutor Reed stiffened, his confident facade fracturing ever so slightly. Elena's voice remained steady, deliberate. 12 years. She let the words hang in the air, letting them settle. That's how long I've served as a special agent with the United States Secret Service. That's 12 years protecting presidents, foreign dignitaries, and high-level officials. 12 years investigating federal crimes, conducting interrogations, and overseeing security operations at the highest levels of government. She took a step closer to the witness stand, turning slightly to address the jury. I have testified before Congress. I have coordinated with the FBI, the CIA, and multiple law enforcement agencies. I have analyzed security footage for some of the most sensitive investigations in this country's history. Her gaze flicked back to Whitman, unwavering. So tell me, Your Honor, do you still think I lack practical experience? The courtroom was so still, so silent, that Elena could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. For the first time since this trial began, Judge Whitman didn't have a response. His lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers curling slightly against the bench. A calculated move, an attempt to regain control. But it was too late. The balance had shifted. And now, it was Elena Monroe who held the power in the room. Soft chuckles rippled through the gallery, low and knowing. Elena Monroe had heard that sound before, the laughter of men who underestimated her. She didn't react. Didn't frown. Didn't falter. She simply waited. Judge Whitman's gaze was steady, cold, unreadable. A rigged game. As the afternoon dragged on, Malcolm's defense attorney made a weak attempt to present new evidence, eyewitness testimony that contradicted the arresting officer's report, records of prior misconduct by the same officer. But Judge Whitman barely glanced at the documents before dismissing them with a wave of his hand. Irrelevant, he declared, his tone clipped. We are not here to relitigate the past. This trial is about the present case, not some ghost hunt into prior accusations. Elena's fingers curled against the edge of the table. She had seen this strategy before. Diminish. Distract. Dismiss. A carefully orchestrated method to strip the defense of any foothold, to control the narrative before it could shift. And it was working. But Judge Whitman had miscalculated. Because Elena Monroe had something he had not accounted for, patience. She hadn't come here to play by his rules. She had come to end the game. A moment of restraint. The judge called for a recess. As the courtroom emptied, Elena rose, her heels clicking softly against the marble as she stepped into the hallway. The air outside was cooler, but it did nothing to ease the tight coil of tension in her chest. Behind her, Malcolm followed, his voice low, raw with exhaustion. "Angie, I don't know how much more of this I can take." He let out a breath, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. "That man." He stopped, shaking his head. "He's already made up his mind. It doesn't matter what we say." Elena turned to face him, placing both hands on his shoulders, grounding him. Her gaze was unwavering. "Listen to me, Malcolm." Her voice was firm, steady. "This isn't over. Not yet. And you are not fighting this alone." His eyes searched hers, the weight of fear and frustration pressing down on him like a leaden chain. And then, after a long, heavy moment, he nodded. A small motion, but it was enough. His shoulders, once rigid with tension, eased slightly beneath her touch. A shift in the air. Elena's gaze flickered toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Her mind was racing, calculating. She had waited long enough. Let Judge Whitman dig his own grave with his arrogance. When the trial resumed, it would be time to strike. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people returned to their seats. The doors slammed shut behind them, sealing everyone inside the thick, suffocating tension. Elena Monroe moved toward the defense table with measured, deliberate steps, each one infused with quiet determination. Behind her, Malcolm followed. His head was slightly bowed, but the weight on his shoulders seemed lighter. Whatever she had told him during the recess, it had worked. He clung to it now, like a man grasping a lifeline in the middle of a storm. And then, Judge Whitman entered, the heavy folds of his black robe billowing behind him like a cloak of power. Judge Whitman settled into his high-backed chair, his expression a careful balance of impatience and smugness. To him, this case was nothing more than a formality. Another cog in the machine he had been operating for decades. What he didn't realize was that machine was about to break. The machine of justice, as he defined it. The gavel struck the bench, its sharp crack reverberating through the courtroom. Court is now back in session. His gaze swept the room, pausing when it landed on Elena. There it was again. That barely concealed smirk, the quiet expectation that she would stay in her seat, accept defeat, bow to the inevitable. But Elena Monroe had never been one to meet expectations. The final argument. Prosecutor Reed wasted no time. He rose smoothly, his posture commanding, his voice crisp, polished, deliberate. His closing argument unfolded like a well-rehearsed script, every word carefully chosen to paint Malcolm Monroe as a defiant, uncooperative criminal. He framed him as a man who had recklessly disregarded law enforcement, a man who deserved to face the full weight of punishment. He dismissed every shred of evidence presented by the defense. Called it irrelevant, labeled it a distraction from the truth. The jury listened, silent, unreadable. Elena listened too, but not with worry. Not yet. She had spent her entire career mastering patience, knowing exactly when to act, when to strike. And that moment was approaching fast. A courtroom on the edge. When Reed finally sat down, Judge Whitman leaned forward, his voice as condescending as ever. "Does the defense have any last-minute theatrics before we move to a verdict?" Elena glanced at Malcolm's defense attorney, who hesitated, visibly shaken by the judge's relentless dismissiveness. Before he could muster a response, Elena stood. The room shifted. A ripple of movement, a change in air pressure, as if the very walls recognized the shift in control. "Your Honor, I would like to address this court directly." A flicker of surprise crossed Whitman's face before he masked it with something between amusement and irritation. "Ms. Monroe, I believe I've already given you more than enough time to speak. If you have nothing new, nothing truly relevant, I suggest you sit down." Elena did not sit. She stepped forward instead, her heels clicking against the floor in the suffocating silence of the courtroom. She stopped at the center, where every eye was now locked on her. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I have something critical to say, something I believe this court needs to hear." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, waving a hand dismissively. "Fine. But make it quick. I have other cases to get through." Elena stepped to the center of the courtroom, her movements controlled, deliberate. She let her gaze sweep over the room, pausing just long enough to make each person feel the weight of her presence before finally settling her eyes on Judge Whitman. The air felt thick, heavy, like the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Still, she remained calm. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket. A single, fluid motion, practiced, precise, as she pulled out a sleek black leather wallet and flipped it open. The polished metal inside caught the overhead lights, gleaming, demanding attention. "My name is..." Her voice rang out, crisp, deliberate, each syllable cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "Special Agent Elena Monroe, United States Secret Service." The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, a surge of movement rippling through the courtroom like a shockwave. Reed went rigid, his jaw clenching so hard it looked like he might crack a tooth. The arrogance that had been radiating off of him for the entire trial evaporated in an instant. Even Malcolm's defense attorney, who had spent most of the proceedings fumbling with paperwork, now sat motionless, wide-eyed. But the only person who didn't move, the only one utterly, completely frozen, was Judge Whitman. His face had gone pale. The arrogance, the smugness, the condescension, all of it had been wiped clean. For the first time in this entire trial, he had nothing to say. For the first time, he wasn't in control. A broken facade. Judge Whitman's smirk faltered, just slightly. The confidence in his eyes flickered, replaced by something colder. Something dangerously close to fear. For the first time that day, he didn't have a ready retort. Elena didn't wait for him to regain his footing. Her voice remained steady, unwavering. "I have spent the past 10 years serving this country, protecting its leaders, and upholding the law. And I will not stand by while this court, or any court, twists justice to fit a narrative built on bias and power." The silence that followed was deafening. It took Judge Whitman a few beats too long to find his voice. And when he did, it lacked the same effortless authority he had wielded so easily before. "Agent Monroe," he said, forcing out the words, his tone uneven. "I fail to see how your credentials are relevant to this case." Elena let a small smile curl at the corner of her lips, just enough to be noticed. But it never reached her eyes. "Oh, they're very relevant, Your Honor." She tilted her head just slightly, her tone smooth but pointed. "Because they speak to my experience, my integrity, and my ability to recognize when someone is abusing their power." The words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in a simple, undeniable truth. Judge Whitman didn't respond. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. A shift in power. The room had shifted. The weight of it was tangible, pressing down on everyone inside. All eyes flicked between Elena and the man who, just minutes ago, had been dismissing her without a second thought. And then, Elena turned, slowly, deliberately, facing the jury. Her gaze was steady. Her voice, unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the truth. I stand here today as a sister, as a witness, and as someone who still believes in the justice system. But I also stand here as someone who knows what it means to fight for what is right, no matter the cost. Malcolm Monroe is not a criminal. He is a man who was unjustly targeted, just like so many others who look like him. And I will not allow this court to uphold that injustice any longer. The air in the courtroom grew thick, suffocating. Every word Elena spoke was like a spark igniting dry kindling. Across the bench, Judge Whitman's face had turned an unpleasant shade of red. His hands gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, as if he were physically restraining himself from losing control. "You have said enough, Agent Monroe." His voice was tight, every syllable strained with barely contained fury. "This courtroom is not a platform for your speeches." Elena took another step forward, the glow of the courtroom lights reflecting off the badge she still held aloft. "This courtroom," she said, her voice steady, unwavering, "is exactly the place for the truth. And it's about time someone said it." For the first time that day, Judge Whitman had nothing to say. The room seemed suspended in a stunned, breathless moment. As if Elena's words had drained every ounce of air from the space. The badge in her hand gleamed beneath the harsh lights, a small but undeniable symbol of power, casting a shadow over the entire trial. She stood her ground. Unshaken. Unmoving. Across the courtroom, at the defense table, Malcolm watched his sister. There was something new in his eyes, something that had been missing for weeks. Respect. Relief. Hope. He had always known Elena was strong. But watching her dismantle Judge Whitman's arrogance with absolute composure filled him with something he hadn't felt in a long time: belief. On the other side of the room, Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His hands clenched tightly around the armrests, his knuckles bone-white. The smug smirk he had worn so confidently throughout the trial was long gone. Instead, his expression had hardened into something else entirely. Tension. Discomfort. Something dangerously close to fear. For years, he had ruled this courtroom with unchecked authority. For years, his gavel had been a weapon, a tool to silence those he deemed unworthy. But today, for the first time, he was the one forced into silence. The respect he had always assumed was his to command, his by right, was crumbling. And as he sat there, staring at the unwavering force of Elena Monroe, a chilling realization settled in his gut. For the first time in his career, he was no longer in control. Elena shattered the silence, her voice soft but razor-sharp. "Your Honor, earlier you questioned what qualifies me to speak on law enforcement. Allow me to give you a full answer." She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the bench. The air in the courtroom shifted. Every person in attendance leaned forward, drawn into the moment. Even the court stenographer, whose fingers had been flying across the keyboard all day, hesitated, hands hovering, unwilling to miss a single word. "For the past decade, I have served as a special agent with the United States Secret Service." Her voice was steady, unshaken. "During that time, I have conducted investigations, protected national leaders, and upheld the very principles of justice this country was built on. My badge is not just a symbol of authority. It is a commitment to truth, to fairness, and to the law." Each word rang through the chamber, heavy, undeniable. At the prosecutor's table, Reed was no longer composed. His fingers fidgeted against his tie, his gaze flicking toward Judge Whitman, silently pleading for him to regain control. But Whitman didn't move. The man who had wielded his gavel like a weapon throughout this trial, who had silenced objections with a wave of his hand. Now, he sat frozen. His tongue, once sharp enough to cut down any opposition, suddenly useless against Elena's sheer presence. She turned, her gaze settling on the jury. One by one, she met their eyes. "Today, you have been given the responsibility to deliver a verdict." Her voice softened, but her resolve remained firm. "But how can we expect justice to be served when the scales have been tipped before the trial even began? My brother, Malcolm Monroe, was labeled a criminal, not because of his actions, but because of the color of his skin. And that bias does not stop with the officer who arrested him. It exists at every level of this system, including in this very courtroom. A murmur rippled through the audience. Her words weren't just heard. They landed. They settled. A middle-aged woman on the jury shifted in her seat, her expression conflicted. Her gaze flickered toward Judge Whitman, then back to Elena, as if she were reconsidering everything she had accepted up until now. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. "Ms. Monroe. It's Agent Monroe." Elena's voice sliced through his interruption like a blade. A correction. A challenge. A slap across the courtroom floor. The weight of it struck hard. Whitman fell silent. For the first time, he looked at her not as a defendant's sister, not as an inconvenience to be dismissed, but as an equal. Perhaps, even, as a threat. Elena's gaze remained locked on him. "And with all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not finished." Judge Whitman opened his mouth, then closed it. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darkened with anger and something else, uncertainty. For the first time in his decades-long career, he could not control the course of his own courtroom. The realization sat heavy on his face. Elena turned back to the defense table, carefully placing her badge on the polished wooden surface. It lay there, catching the light, a silent, undeniable reminder of her authority. A challenge to anyone who dared to question her. She braced both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly, her voice steady, resolute. "The evidence is indisputable. The video shows Malcolm being shoved to the ground without justification. Witnesses have testified to the officer's aggression. And yet, this court has chosen to dismiss all of it, to ignore the truth in favor of preserving a narrative that has been embedded in this system for far too long." She straightened, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. Not a single sound. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. She let the silence stretch, let her words sink into the suffocating tension that gripped the room. "But I will not allow my brother, or anyone else, to be consumed by a system that values power over justice. Not today. Not ever." A murmur rippled through the audience, the energy in the room swelling to a breaking point. Elena exhaled evenly, then lowered herself into her seat beside Malcolm. He turned to her, his expression filled with gratitude, and something deeper. Pride. A judge without control. Judge Whitman remained motionless. His face was red, caught between fury and discomfort. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the absolute authority it once carried. "Agent Monroe, your credentials may be impressive, but they do not grant you the right to undermine this court." Elena's response came instantly, calm but unwavering. "I'm not here to undermine this court, Your Honor." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle before she spoke them. "I'm here to ensure that justice is served. And if that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should ask yourself why." A hush fell over the courtroom. The tension was palpable, thick enough to suffocate. All eyes were on Judge Whitman now. Watching. Waiting. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw clenched. At the prosecution table, Reed flipped through his stack of documents in frantic desperation, searching for something, anything, to regain control. But there was nothing. Nothing he could say. Nothing he could do. Because the balance of power had already shifted. And Elena Monroe had just forced them all to see it. Judge Whitman clenched his jaw so tightly that the muscle ticked beneath his skin. For the first time in years, he was no longer in control of his own courtroom. And he knew it. His fingers curled against the armrests of his chair as he shifted, trying to summon the authority that had always come so easily to him. But the weight of Elena Monroe's words still hung in the air, and for once, his usual air of dominance wasn't enough to sweep them away. At the prosecution table, Reed's hands moved frantically over his documents, flipping through pages in a desperate attempt to grasp onto something, anything, that could turn the tide back in his favor. But there was nothing. Because the moment had already shifted. The courtroom, once a place where Judge Whitman dictated the rules, had transformed into something else entirely. A battlefield. And he was losing. A verdict that can't be ignored. The room remained thick with tension. The jury sat rigid, their eyes bouncing between Elena, Judge Whitman, and Reed. At the defense table, Malcolm was silent, his posture no longer tense with fear but with something else, anticipation. Judge Whitman inhaled sharply through his nose, the sound barely audible, but it was enough for Elena to recognize it for what it was. Restraint. A man swallowing his anger because he had been outmaneuvered. He adjusted his robe unnecessarily, as if smoothing the fabric could restore his lost authority. Then, finally, he spoke. "We will proceed to closing arguments." His voice was clipped, controlled, but missing the usual confidence that once laced his every word. A murmur ran through the courtroom. It was subtle, but Elena caught the shift in posture from the jury, the way their gazes had changed. The way doubt had settled in. They had seen Judge Whitman falter. They had seen Elena Monroe stand tall. And now, they could no longer ignore the truth staring them in the face. The balance of power had shifted. And for the first time, justice finally had a chance to win. The courtroom remained engulfed in tense silence. Everyone present understood, on some level, that something monumental had just taken place, even if the full impact of it had yet to settle. "This court will recess." Judge Whitman's voice lacked its usual certainty. "We will reconvene later." The gavel struck wood, but the sound was hollow, like the final breath of a man watching his empire crumble. Elena watched as he stood, his movements stiff, controlled, as if trying to mask the unraveling beneath his judicial robe. She said nothing as he left, her expression unreadable. Then, she turned to Malcolm, her hand resting on his shoulder. "It's not over." Her voice was low, steady. Not even close. Even though Judge Whitman had walked out, the silence remained. The gavel's echo still lingered in the air. Only after the heavy doors shut behind him did the hushed murmurs begin to rise, whispers threading through the gallery, exchanged glances filled with speculation. Conversation sparked between the spectators, low and urgent. Something had shifted. A storm that wouldn't pass. But Elena Monroe remained seated, composed as ever, as if nothing had happened. She had weathered far worse storms than this. Beside her, Malcolm was silent, but his eyes were locked on her, searching. For reassurance. For some kind of answer. "Angie." He leaned in slightly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You really shook him." A pause. "I've never seen a judge lose his composure like that." Elena didn't respond right away. She reached for the glass of water on the table, moving deliberately, methodically. She took a slow sip before setting it down, her fingers tapping lightly against the cool surface. Only then did she turn to Malcolm, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about rattling him, Malcolm." Her eyes sharpened. "It's about exposing the truth. And the truth always makes the arrogant uncomfortable." Malcolm nodded, but his concern was still evident in the tightness around his eyes. "You think it was enough?" He hesitated. "Do you think he actually listened?" A flicker of a smile ghosted across Elena's lips, just for a moment, a crack in her usual composed exterior. "Men like Whitman don't listen, Malcolm." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel behind it. "They react. And when backed into a corner, they do one of two things: they fight to hold on to control, or they collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Either way, we're ready." The fallout begins. The recess dragged on longer than expected. Outside the courtroom, the once quiet hallways of Fulton County Courthouse had erupted into a frenzy. Reporters, many of whom had barely paid attention to the case before, now clustered in groups, notebooks in hand, cameras rolling. The revelation of Elena's true identity had spread like wildfire. The courthouse had become a hive of speculation. Elena Monroe wasn't just a woman fighting for her brother's freedom anymore. She had become the story. And now, the whole world was watching. Elena remained seated at the defense table, her back straight, fingers loosely interlaced in front of her. She did not flinch under the lingering stares from the spectators who had chosen to remain. Some looked at her with admiration. Others, with doubt. But no one could ignore the quiet authority she carried. The return of the court. The heavy wooden doors swung open. All rise. Court is now back in session. Elena rose to her feet, slow, deliberate. Beside her, Malcolm stood as well. His breathing was controlled, though she could feel the tension humming beneath his skin. Judge Whitman entered. His face was still flushed, but his expression was carefully schooled. If the recess had helped him regain composure, it had not restored the absolute confidence he once wielded. He lowered himself into his chair, gripping the gavel tightly. For a long moment, he simply sat there, scanning the courtroom, his gaze daring anyone to challenge his authority. But the cracks in his facade were showing. The slight tremor in his fingers. The way his lips pressed together just a little too tightly. Finally, he spoke. "Before we proceed," he said, each word measured, "I feel it necessary to remind this courtroom of the standards of conduct expected here. While Agent Monroe's credentials may be noteworthy, they do not exempt her from the decorum required in these proceedings." Elena met his stare, unblinking. She said nothing. Letting the silence settle, stretch. It was not defiance. It was control. And it unsettled Judge Whitman more than any direct confrontation ever could. A desperate attempt. Sensing an opportunity, Prosecutor Reed quickly seized the moment. He rose, his voice dripping with forced composure, as though he had just regained the upper hand. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "I believe it is imperative that we refocus on the facts of this case. Agent Monroe's testimony, while compelling, ultimately does not change the fundamental reality that." But he hesitated. Because Elena wasn't reacting. She was simply watching him. Waiting. She let the silence stretch again, an invisible weight pressing down on the courtroom. No one spoke. Because the truth was already there, laid bare. Undeniable. Uncontrollable. The evidence is clear. Judge Whitman's voice finally broke the silence, but it no longer carried the unwavering authority it once did. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly together, as if gripping onto what little control he still had. But that does not excuse the defendant from resisting arrest. The final blow. Elena stood, slow, measured. Every movement intentional. When she spoke, her voice was not raised. But it carried across the room with absolute certainty. "Your Honor, this evidence does more than justify my brother's defense." She let her gaze sweep across the courtroom. "It proves that he is innocent." A beat of silence. What this courtroom has witnessed today is not just the truth, it is the reality of a system that was never designed to serve justice equally. The weight of her words settled over the room, pressing down on every person inside. This was no longer just about Malcolm Monroe. This was about every name before his. And every name that would come after. And now, with the world watching, the system had nowhere left to hide. Elena's words settled into the space like a weight no one could shake off. The courtroom remained utterly still, so silent that it felt as if no one dared to breathe. Judge Whitman's face darkened, his grip on the bench tightening, knuckles widening with the force of his restraint. "Agent Monroe, you are walking a very thin line." Elena took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "No, Your Honor, I am standing on the only line that matters, the line of truth." A murmur rippled through the room, the tension reaching an almost unbearable peak. Judge Whitman's gavel slammed against the bench, crack of wood against wood, sharp and desperate. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." But the weight of his authority had diminished. His voice no longer carried the unshakable dominance it once did, only the frustration of a man watching his grip slip through his fingers. Elena returned to her seat, her expression calm, though her eyes held an unspoken certainty. She had done what she needed to do. Now, the system had to decide. Would it uphold the truth? Or would it crumble beneath the weight of its own failures? A verdict yet to come. Judge Whitman slammed his gavel once more, but this time, the sound did not command control. It was the hollow, futile attempt of a man trying to reassert his dominance over something already slipping beyond his reach. When court adjourned for the day, Elena placed a firm hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "It's not over yet." Her voice was steady, resolute. "But we are closer than we've ever been." Malcolm nodded, his eyes carrying something new, something that hadn't been there for weeks. Hope. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be within reach. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind them, Elena knew that the battle was far from over. But she was ready for whatever came next. The weight of the moment. The hallways of Fulton County Courthouse were unusually quiet as Elena Monroe walked beside Malcolm, their footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. The air felt thick, charged, an aftershock of what had just transpired inside that courtroom. Her face remained composed, revealing nothing. But Malcolm knew her well enough to see the tension in the rigid set of her jaw, in the way her fingers curled slightly, as if gripping something invisible, something heavy. Something that was far from finished. Malcolm was the first to break the silence. "Do you really think he'll let the evidence change the outcome? Or is this just a performance, where they pretend to listen, but the ending was decided before we ever walked into that courtroom?" Elena stopped mid-step, turning to face him. The fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp lines across her features, highlighting the unwavering intensity in her eyes. She was silent for a moment, carefully choosing her words. "Malcolm," she said softly. "I've stood in rooms filled with people who believed they controlled everything. Men with power, with influence, men whose arrogance convinced them they were untouchable. And they all had one thing in common." She held his gaze. "They all fell when the truth came to light. Judge Whitman is no different. He knows the walls are closing in." Malcolm studied her, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if he wanted to believe her words but wasn't sure he could. But what if he still bends the truth? What if he just... He stopped himself. Because saying it out loud would make it real. Elena placed a firm hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "If he bends the truth, we straighten it. If he blocks the path to justice, we push harder. This isn't just about you, Malcolm. It's about every person who has ever walked into a courtroom already judged before they could even speak. And I won't stop until they understand that." Her voice was steady. Unshaken. For the first time that day, Malcolm allowed himself a small smile. "You always know exactly what to say." His voice was quiet but sincere. The corner of Elena's mouth twitched, the briefest flicker of amusement. "It's part of the job. A courtroom on edge." By the time they re-entered the courtroom, something had shifted. At first, it was subtle, just the way the spectators whispered more urgently among themselves, the way eyes darted toward Elena with something between curiosity and uncertainty. But Elena felt it on a deeper level. This wasn't just a reaction to what she had said. It was the weight of a truth that had been unearthed. A realization that could not be ignored. Then, Judge Whitman entered. His steps were heavier than before, his posture still upright but no longer effortless. His face remained neutral, carefully composed, but Elena noticed the tension in the fine lines around his eyes, the way his fingers tapped against the handle of the gavel as if testing its weight. Testing whether it still held the power he had always believed it did. The balance of the courtroom had shifted. And now, for the first time, Judge Whitman wasn't certain if the gavel in his hand would be enough to hold it together. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, the sharp sound cutting through the heavy silence of the room. The court will now proceed with closing arguments. His voice carried the strained authority of a man who had been challenged but refused to yield. However, I will remind everyone that this is a courtroom. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. The law is not a stage for personal grievances or theatrical displays. From across the courtroom, Elena held his stare, unwavering. If he thought veiled warnings would intimidate her, he was mistaken. The prosecution's last stand. Prosecutor Reed pushed back his chair and stood. With deliberate precision, he adjusted his tie before stepping to the center of the courtroom. The confidence was back in his stride. Or at least, it was an expertly rehearsed performance of confidence. Your Honor, members of the jury. His voice was smooth, calculated. What we have witnessed today is nothing more than a distraction. The defense has deliberately steered attention away from the facts of this case, offering irrelevant testimony and emotional appeals that hold no legal weight. He moved slowly as he spoke, his eyes scanning the jury, searching for any shift in their expressions. The truth is simple. Malcolm Monroe resisted arrest. The evidence proves it. The officer's testimony confirms it. And despite the defense's attempts to muddy the waters, the law remains clear. His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed in the inevitability of his argument. But Elena watched him closely. She did not react. Did not shift. Did not blink. She had learned long ago that silence was also power. And right now, she wielded it masterfully. Reed finished with a sharp, deliberate motion of his hand before returning to his seat, a hint of self-satisfaction tugging at the corners of his mouth. But as he sat, Elena caught something else in his expression. A flicker of hesitation. A fracture in his certainty. The defense fights back. When the defense attorney rose, Elena leaned forward slightly, fingers laced together in front of her. The nervous energy he had carried at the start of the trial had been replaced by something steadier. Something stronger. She recognized that look. That quiet resolve. It was the result of everything she had done today. She had given him confidence. And now, he was using it. Your Honor, members of the jury. His voice was firm. This case is not just about resisting arrest. It is about responsibility. It is about recognizing when those in power have abused it. And most importantly, it is about ensuring that justice is not just an abstract idea, but a principle that is actively upheld. He paused, letting the words settle, letting them sink into the minds of the people who mattered most. Because justice should not be determined by who holds the most authority, but by who tells the truth. The defense attorney gestured toward the screen, where the crucial video evidence had been played earlier. You've seen the footage. You've heard the testimony. Malcolm Monroe did not resist arrest. He was assaulted, humiliated, and wrongfully accused. And this court has an obligation to acknowledge that truth. As he spoke, Elena silently observed the jury. She saw it, the shift. The hardness in their eyes softened. The way they looked at Malcolm was no longer distant or skeptical. It was understanding. It was human. A call for courage. Justice demands courage. The attorney's voice was steady, but firm. I ask that you show that courage today. Then, he sat. And the courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Every gaze turned to Judge Whitman, who remained motionless. For a long moment, he did nothing, just stared down at the file before him, his fingers tracing the edge of his gavel. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. His gaze swept over the room, slow, deliberate. Then, his voice came, clipped and rigid. The jury will now deliberate. A pause. Court is adjourned until a verdict is reached. The gavel struck down. A final, abrupt motion, then he was gone. Judge Whitman rose quickly, leaving no room for argument, no space for anyone to speak. The bailiff signaled for everyone to remain in place until the judge had left. And then, the room erupted into hushed, frantic whispers. The weight of the moment. Elena turned to Malcolm, her gaze sharp but composed. "This is it." A steady breath. "Now, we wait." Malcolm nodded, his hands unconsciously clasping together on the table in front of him. His voice was quieter now, edged with uncertainty. "Do you think they saw the truth? I mean, the jury?" Elena placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. Her eyes locked onto his. "They saw it, Malcolm." A beat of silence. "Now, they just have to decide whether they have the courage to act on it." The wait. The room gradually emptied, but Elena remained seated. Her mind ran through every detail, every moment, every possible outcome. She knew this battle wasn't over. Not yet. But she also knew something else. Truth has a way of breaking through. Even in the darkest places. At this moment, all they could do was wait. Time moved sluggishly, each tick of the courtroom clock dragging like a taunt, mocking those who sat in anxious anticipation of the verdict. Elena Monroe sat beside Malcolm, her hands lightly clasped on her lap, her posture unwavering. But inside, her mind was a live wire of tension, running through every possible outcome, every angle, every flaw in the system that could still turn against them. She knew this system did not prioritize truth. It prioritized control. And for far too long, Judge Whitman and men like him had been the ones controlling the narrative. A brother's fear. Malcolm shifted beside her, tension weighing heavily on his broad shoulders. "Angie." His voice was quiet, cutting through the prolonged silence. "What if this doesn't go our way?" Elena turned to him, her gaze steady, unwavering. "If it doesn't, we keep fighting. This case is just one battle, Malcolm. The fight for justice is bigger than this room, bigger than this verdict. You are not alone." Her words weren't just for him. They were a reminder to herself. That truth could be stalled, but it could never be extinguished. The verdict. The doors swung open. "All rise." The bailiff's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "The jury has reached a verdict." Chairs scraped. Feet shuffled. The weight of expectation thickened the air. Elena rose slowly, smoothing the hem of her coat with a practiced hand. Beside her, Malcolm stood as well, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Without a word, Elena placed a steady hand on his arm, grounding him. Then, Judge Whitman entered. His gait was stiffer than before, his movements measured. His expression remained neutral, but Elena saw the strain in the tightness of his jaw, the way his eyes deliberately avoided hers as he lowered himself into his seat. The gavel struck. A sharp, hollow sound that cut through the charged atmosphere. "Be seated." His voice was flat, empty. But the room obeyed. The creaking of wooden chairs filled the silence. Then, the foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with streaks of silver in her hair, her expression taut with the weight of the moment, rose. In her hands, a single slip of paper. Small. Yet it carried the weight of the entire room. The forewoman cleared her throat, hesitating slightly before speaking. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a unanimous verdict." Elena's heartbeat remained steady, but her breath felt heavier in her chest. She cast a quick glance at Malcolm, who stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. This was it. "Defendant, please rise." Judge Whitman's voice rang out, devoid of emotion. Malcolm rose. His tall frame, usually solid and unwavering, seemed almost smaller beneath the invisible weight of this moment. He stood motionless, as if the words hadn't quite reached reality yet. Beside him, Elena stood as well. A silent but resolute presence. The verdict. The forewoman unfolded the small slip of paper, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She glanced at Malcolm for a fraction of a second before lifting her eyes to Judge Whitman. Then, she spoke. On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant, Malcolm Monroe, not guilty. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Not a breath. Not a word. As if the weight of the verdict needed a moment to settle into the bones of everyone present. Then, the silence shattered. A ripple of hushed voices swept across the room. A mixture of relief, disbelief, quiet triumph, and murmurs of dissent. Elena exhaled, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. Beside her, Malcolm wavered for just a moment, his legs almost giving out under the sudden release of tension that had gripped him for so long. She caught him, her fingers tightening around his arm, steadying him. The judge's defeat. Order. Judge Whitman's voice was razor-sharp, slicing through the noise. His gavel struck the bench with force. I want order in this courtroom. The murmurs died down, but the energy in the air did not dissipate. The judge's face was rigid, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. When his gaze flicked toward Elena, something flickered there, not rage, but something bitter. The look of a man who knew he had lost. The defendant is free to go. His voice was cold. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck one final time. Then, Judge Whitman stood, his black robe billowing behind him as he strode toward the exit. He did not look back. The doors slammed shut behind him. And in his absence, the room erupted again. A victory earned. Malcolm turned to Elena, his eyes wide, his voice nothing more than a hushed, disbelieving whisper. Angie, we did it. A beat. Then, Elena shook her head, a small but knowing smile forming at the corner of her lips. Not we. She looked past him, beyond this one victory, to the battle still ahead. This was bigger than us. Elena spoke, her voice low but steady. You did it. Truth did it. Without warning, Malcolm pulled her into a tight embrace. His shoulders shook, years of restraint, of silent suffering, unraveling all at once. She held onto him, arms firm, steady, anchoring him against the whirlwind of voices, flashing cameras, and microphones being thrust into their space. Questions flew at them from every direction. But Elena didn't care. This wasn't a moment for the press to exploit. This was Malcolm's moment. A moment to reclaim his dignity, his freedom, his life. A quiet victory. Outside the courthouse, the evening air was crisp and sharp, as if the world itself had been refreshed after the storm. The crowd still buzzed behind them, but Elena led Malcolm to a quieter corner on the courthouse steps. She turned to him, placing both hands on his shoulders. This isn't over, Malcolm. Her voice was low, but firm. This is just the beginning. What happened to you wasn't an exception. It's part of a broken system. And we can't stop here. Malcolm nodded. There was something different in his eyes now. A certainty that hadn't been there before. I'll do whatever it takes, Angie. I'll fight, just like you did. A rare smile ghosted across Elena's lips. Not a smile of victory, but of understanding. Because he finally saw it. Because he was ready. I don't need my little brother to be a warrior, Malcolm. But I am proud of you for standing up. And you won. She turned back toward the courthouse, its towering facade bathed in golden light. A reminder of the battle still ahead. But for now, just for this moment, she allowed herself a breath. Today, they had taken one small but undeniable step toward justice. The weight of the moment. The sun dipped lower, painting the city skyline in deep amber and crimson hues. Elena Monroe walked forward, her brother beside her, both of them prepared for whatever came next. The courthouse steps were still alive with movement. Journalists, activists, onlookers. The flashing lights of cameras burst like fireworks, the constant clicking a reminder that this moment was bigger than them. That this was no longer just about one case, one verdict. It was something far greater. Yet Elena remained composed. She moved through the crowd with quiet determination, her hand resting lightly on Malcolm's arm, guiding him, shielding him. Because no matter what came next, she would make sure he was ready. The fight isn't over. Agent Monroe. A reporter's voice cut through the crowd, sharp and demanding. Now that your brother has been acquitted, what's your next move? Do you plan to sue the officer involved? Elena didn't slow down. She kept her gaze forward, her posture unwavering. Today is about my brother and his freedom. Her voice was steady, measured, but firm. The fight for justice isn't over, but right now, we need a moment to breathe. The crowd gradually parted as they descended the courthouse steps, granting them a sliver of space away from the relentless press. She led Malcolm toward the waiting car, its sleek black exterior reflecting the fading hues of twilight. The driver stepped out, opening the door for them. But Malcolm hesitated. He turned to her, his voice quieter now. Angie. A pause. I don't even know how to thank you. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be standing here today. Elena placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her eyes unwavering. I'm your sister, Malcolm. I'll always stand beside you. A beat. Then, softer. But what happens next, that's your choice. Use this freedom. Make it mean something. Be the man I already know you can be. A lump formed in Malcolm's throat, but he swallowed hard and nodded. I will. Months later. The apartment was modest, but organized, papers spread across Elena's dining table, some stacked neatly, others marked with highlighter and notes in the margins. The case against the officer who had arrested Malcolm had gained significant traction since his acquittal. Public outrage, fueled by undeniable evidence, had ignited a fierce debate across the country. Activists, legal scholars, even a handful of lawmakers, had begun pushing for a broader investigation into systemic failures within the justice system. And somewhere in the midst of it all, Elena had found herself taking on a role she had never anticipated. Not just a protector, but an advocate. Not just for her brother, but for the countless others who had been silenced by a broken system. She balanced the weight of two worlds. Her responsibilities as a Secret Service agent, and her newfound mission. Speaking at community forums. Meeting with reform organizations. Her phone vibrated, pulling her from the sea of documents. She glanced at the screen, and a rare smile touched her lips. Hey, Angie. Malcolm's voice crackled through the speaker, lighter than it had been in years. Just wanted to let you know, I spoke at a youth center today. I told my story. The kids there, they're going through what I went through. I think it made a difference. For the first time in a long time, his voice carried something new. Purpose. And Elena knew. This was only the beginning. A new purpose. A quiet swell of pride rose in Elena's chest. That's incredible, Malcolm. I'm proud of you. She could hear the excitement in his voice, the energy still buzzing from his experience. You should have seen their faces when I finished talking. His words carried the weight of something real, something transformative. I told them what you once told me, that this fight isn't over. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. Elena leaned back in her chair, exhaling as warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. You're doing good, Malcolm. Keep going. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. Silence settled over the apartment, but in Elena's mind, thoughts continued to race. The road ahead was long, filled with battles yet to be fought. But moments like this, moments where change was tangible, reminded her why she kept pushing forward. A voice for justice. Weeks later, Elena stood before a packed auditorium. The stage lights illuminated her figure against the dark backdrop. Below her, faces filled the seats: community members, attorneys, students, activists. They had come for a panel on criminal justice reform. They had come to listen. Not to a Secret Service agent, but to a sister, a witness, and a fighter for justice. She stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. Then, she spoke. Justice is not a given. Her voice was deep and steady. It is something we must fight for. Something we must demand. She let the words settle, her eyes scanning the audience. My brother's story is just one of many. But it is a reminder that when we stand together, when we refuse to be silent, change is possible. She paused. Let the weight of her words sink into the stillness of the room. This isn't just about Malcolm. It isn't just about me. It is about every person who has ever been forced into silence, ignored, or wrongfully judged. It is about building a system that values people over prejudice, truth over power. The ripple effect. Applause erupted. A wave of sound, rolling through the auditorium. But Elena remained still. She let the moment wash over her, absorbing the weight of what had just been spoken. She understood the responsibility that came with these words. And she also felt the hope. A quiet but undeniable hope. That change was not only possible, but inevitable. Because moments like these ripples, could turn into waves. A stand for justice. As Elena stepped back from the podium, the applause grew louder. The crowd rose to their feet, voices merging into a unified wave of support. A moment of recognition. A moment of solidarity. She took it all in, then turned and walked off the stage, head held high, shoulders squared. She was ready for whatever came next. Because justice was never easy. But it was always worth the fight. What would you do? If you were in Elena's position, what would you do? Have you ever had to stand up for the truth, even when faced with overwhelming obstacles? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might inspire someone else to take a stand. If this story made you think, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and loved ones. Together, we can amplify the message of justice and accountability. Thank you for watching and supporting. Let's take action, one voice, one step at a time, toward a justice system that truly serves everyone. Stay strong. Stay resolute. And never stop fighting for what's right. Subscribe for more. Thank you for supporting the channel. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. These stories are curated from various sources and do not represent any specific individual or organization. They are shared to highlight the human values that shape our lives and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any inaccuracies, we appreciate your understanding. Wishing you all the best on your journey.